June 2006. The Amazon rainforest is not just a forest. It is a living, breathing entity that swallows secrets whole. For Dr. Arthur Sterling, a world-renowned botanist, and his 12-year-old son, Leo, the jungle was supposed to be a classroom. They weren't tourists. They were on a mission to document rare medicinal flora in the untouched Javari Valley, one of the most remote and unexplored sectors of the Brazilian Amazon. Equipped with a satellite phone, 2 weeks of rations, and years of jungle survival experience, Arthur was confident. But the Amazon has a way of humbling even the most prepared. On the 10th day of their expedition, the last signal from their GPS tracker pinged from a location where the canopy was so thick that even sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. The message sent to Arthur's wife back in London was simple: "We've found something that shouldn't exist." Heading deeper to verify. Back in 48 hours. Arthur and Leo never came back. The search operations were massive. The Brazilian military, local indigenous guides, and private search and rescue teams spent 6 months scouring the Javari Valley. They found abandoned campsites from other travelers, unmapped river tributaries, and dangerous predators. But of the Sterlings, there wasn't so much as a shredded piece of fabric or a footprint. It was as if the jungle had simply erased them from existence. By the end of the first year, the case was cold. The world moved on, and the Sterlings were added to the long, tragic list of those taken by the Green Abyss. Fast forward 20 years to early 2026. Global Environmental Monitoring, GM, a private tech firm, was testing its new deep LiDAR satellite, a technology capable of seeing through the densest foliage to map the ground terrain for archaeological ruins. While scanning the Javari Valley for signs of ancient pre-Columbian civilizations, the satellite's AI flagged a massive anomaly at the exact coordinates where Arthur Sterling's last signal had originated. When the technicians processed the image, the room fell into a stunned silence. It wasn't a ruin. It was a camp, but it wasn't a temporary survival shelter. The LiDAR image revealed a perfectly circular clearing, roughly 50 meters in diameter. In the center sat a structure that looked like a modern laboratory, constructed entirely out of silver-toned metal that didn't reflect the sun. It seemed to absorb it. Even more impossible was the thermal signature. While the surrounding jungle was a humid 32 degrees Celsius, the interior of this impossible camp was a constant, freezing 4 degrees Celsius. "That's not a botanist's tent," whispered the lead analyst. "And look at the perimeter." Surrounding the silver structure were dozens of smaller mounds, arranged in a precise geometric pattern, not like graves, but like pods. Most shocking of all was a single, high-definition optical zoom that the satellite managed to snap during a brief break in the cloud cover. Standing in the center of the clearing was a figure. He was tall, wearing a tattered lab coat that looked 20 years old, holding a device that glowed with a faint violet light. The man looked directly up at the satellite, as if he knew exactly when the shutter would click. Despite the 20 years that had passed, the facial recognition software confirmed it with 99% accuracy. It was Dr. Arthur Sterling. But there was one terrifying detail the AI couldn't explain. Arthur hadn't aged a single day. He looked exactly as he did in the photograph taken the morning he disappeared in 2006. The satellite image didn't just reopen a cold case. It shattered the scientific community's understanding of the Amazon. How could a man survive 20 years in the most hostile environment on Earth and not age a single day? And where was Leo? A covert recovery team, funded by the same tech firm that discovered the anomaly, was assembled. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a containment and acquisition operation. Led by Elias Thorne, a veteran of high-risk extractions, and Dr. Maya Aris, a specialist in bioelectromagnetics. The team was dropped 5 miles from the coordinates. The dense canopy prevented a direct landing, forcing them to trek through the green abyss on foot. As they moved closer to the impossible camp, the jungle began to change. The usual cacophony of the Amazon, the screaming of macaws, the chatter of capuchin monkeys, the buzzing of millions of insects, faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. By the third mile, even the wind seemed to die. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible tension that made the hair on their arms stand up. My equipment is malfunctioning, Maya whispered, tapping her handheld sensor. The electromagnetic field here is inverted. It's like we're walking into a giant biological battery. Suddenly, the lead scout stopped dead. Just ahead, the vibrant green of the jungle hit a hard, straight line. On one side, the lush, chaotic growth of the Amazon. On the other, the plants were different. They were still ferns and vines, but their leaves were a translucent, metallic silver. They didn't sway. They vibrated at a frequency so high it was almost beyond human hearing. Don't touch them, Thorne warned, but it was too late. A drone pilot, trying to clear a path, brushed against a silver vine. Instantly, his tactical glove sparked. A discharge of violet electricity threw him backward, his body convulsing as if hit by a lightning bolt. When they checked him, he was alive, but his vitals were erratic. His pulse, Maya gasped, checking her monitor. It's not beating in a human rhythm anymore. It's syncing with the forest. They reached the edge of the circular clearing seen from space. The Silver Lab stood in the center, a masterpiece of impossible engineering. There were no rivets, no seams, just a single flow of matte silver metal. And there, standing by the entrance, was the figure from the satellite image. Dr. Arthur Sterling. He wasn't wearing shoes. His feet were buried in the silver soil, and thin, glowing violet filaments seemed to grow out of the earth and into his skin. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a component. Arthur, Maya called out, her voice trembling. We're here to take you home. Where's Leo? Arthur didn't turn around immediately. When he finally rotated his head, his movements were smooth, almost mechanical. His eyes weren't the warm brown they remembered from his lectures. They were a solid, glowing violet, pulsing in sync with the silver plants. You shouldn't have come, Arthur said. His voice didn't come from his throat. It echoed from the metallic structure behind him, as if the building itself were speaking. The balance is delicate. Leo is safe. He is the core now. Arthur raised his hand, and the violet light intensified. Suddenly, the ground beneath the team began to shift. The silver mounds they had seen on the satellite image, the pods, started to open. They weren't graves, and they weren't storage. Inside each pod was a human shape, encased in a translucent, amber-like resin. They were explorers, soldiers, and indigenous people who had gone missing in the Javari Valley over the last century. And like Arthur, they weren't dead. Their hearts were beating in a perfect, terrifying unison. The jungle doesn't swallow people, Arthur whispered, as the silver vines began to wrap around Thorne's boots. It archives them, and we've just found the next entry. The clearing was no longer a rescue site. It was a biological processing plant. As the silver pods hissed open, the air filled with the scent of ozone and ancient earth. Dr. Maya Aris watched in horror as the translucent resin inside the pods pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. These weren't just missing people. They were the lost history of the Amazon, preserved in a state of living stasis. Thorne struggled against the silver vines, but the more he pulled, the tighter they coiled. The metallic plants weren't just wrapping around him. They were seeking his ports, his watch, his radio, his heart monitor. Arthur, stop this! Maya screamed, taking a cautious step forward, her hands raised. What did you do to them? What did you do to Leo? Arthur Sterling's face remained a mask of unnatural calm. The violet light in his eyes flickered as he looked toward the central silver structure. I didn't do this, Maya. I discovered it. We came here looking for plants, but we found the source. The Amazon isn't just a forest, it's a global hard drive. It stores the genetic and conscious data of everything that enters its heart. I simply accepted the invitation. He stepped aside, and the silver door of the laboratory dissolved into a mist of liquid metal. Inside, the space was hollow, filled with a massive, vertical column of swirling violet light. Suspended in the center of that light was a figure. It was Leo, but he wasn't the 12-year-old boy from the photos. He was still small, yet his body seemed to be made of shifting light and silver filaments. He was suspended in a fetal position, his eyes closed, but his mind was clearly the engine driving the entire camp. Thousands of silver wires pulsed outward from his chest, connecting to the laboratory walls, the pods, and the very roots of the trees outside. Leo is the core, Arthur whispered, his voice tinged with a terrifying pride. His young mind was the only one flexible enough to interface with the system without breaking. He isn't suffering, Maya. He's dreaming the entire forest. Every leaf that turns, every predator that hunts, it's all being calculated by his subconscious. You turned your son into a processor? Thorn roared, finally drawing his combat knife. He slashed at the vines, but the blade shattered upon contact with the silver fibers. The metal was harder than industrial steel. Suddenly, a high-pitched hum erupted from the column of light. Leo's eyes flew open. They weren't violet. They were a blinding, pure white. The archives responded instantly. The people in the pods, the 1920s explorers, and the missing soldiers began to twitch. Their resin casings cracked, and they stepped out, moving like puppets on invisible strings. They didn't attack. They simply surrounded the recovery team, forming a human wall of different eras. The system has detected a surge, Arthur explained, his form beginning to flicker, as if his physical body were becoming less relevant than the data he represented. It needs more processing power to maintain the clearing's boundary. It has chosen your team. Maya realized the terrifying truth of the satellite image. The impossible camp wasn't just hidden, it was a parasite. It drew people in, stripped them of their aging process by trapping them in a temporal loop, and used their biological energy to run its deep LiDAR, cloaking, and environmental controls. We aren't here to rescue you, Maya whispered, realization dawning on her. The satellite image, it wasn't a mistake. You sent that image, didn't you? You baited us. Arthur smiled, and for a second, a flicker of the old, human Arthur appeared. We needed fresh hardware, Maya. 20 years is a long time for a single crew. The forest is expanding, and the core requires more voices to dream the green. The silver ground beneath Maya's feet began to turn soft, like quicksand. She felt the cold, for degrees Celsius resin starting to bubble up around her ankles. The resin was no longer just a substance. It was a hungry, semi-liquid consciousness. As it rose past Maya's knees, she felt a terrifying sensation, not of drowning, but of merging. Her memories of London, her childhood, and the flight to Brazil began to flicker like a failing light bulb. The silver soil was downloading her, leafing through her mind like a book. Thorn, however, was not going down without a fight. Maya, stay awake. If you stop fighting, you become a ghost in their machine. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a specialized high-frequency sonic grenade, a prototype designed to disrupt electronic signals. Arthur, if Leo is the core, then he's a receiver, Thorn yelled. Let us go, or I'll scramble his brain. Arthur's calm shattered. For the first time, his violet eyes flared with genuine panic. The silver structure behind him vibrated, a low-frequency groan echoing through the clearing. You don't understand, Thorn. You aren't just disrupting a camp, you're disrupting the Amazon. If the core goes offline, the green abyss loses its stabilizer. The forest will reclaim everything, violently. But Thorn didn't listen. He primed the device. Suddenly, the air pressure dropped. The neural canopy, the network of silver wires connecting Leo to the trees, began to glow a furious electric red. Leo, suspended in the light, arched his back. A silent scream tore from his throat, manifesting as a physical shockwave that flattened the silver ferns and sent the tactical team flying. He's reacting to your intent, Arthur shouted over the rising hum. The forest isn't a hard drive anymore. It's a weapon. Maya felt the resin's grip loosen as the system's focus shifted to Thorn. She scrambled out of the liquefying soil, her boots now coated in a shimmering, metallic slime. She looked at the pods. The archived people, the 1920s explorers, and the missing pilots, were no longer standing still. Their eyes had turned red, matching the canopy. They moved in a hive-mind formation, charging toward Thorn with a speed that defied their age. Thorn dropped the grenade. Before he could detonate it, a silver vine shot from the ground like a harpoon, piercing his shoulder. He wasn't pulled away, he was integrated on the spot. Silver filaments erupted from the wound, weaving into his tactical gear, turning his flesh into a living circuit board within seconds. Thorn, Maya screamed. He is being repurposed, Arthur said, his voice now overlapping with 1,000 other whispers. The system needs a defensive firewall. He is the perfect candidate. Maya realized she was the only one left. The resin had stopped rising for her, but the clearing was closing in. The silver structure began to fold in on itself, becoming a vortex of liquid metal. In the center, Leo's white-eyed gaze fixed on her. A voice, small and distorted but unmistakably Leo's, echoed in her mind. Help me. It's too much data. I can see the end of the world. Help me reset the clock. Maya looked at the silver structure. She realized the 4 degrees Celsius temperature wasn't for the humans. It was a cooling system for the core. If she could overheat the structure, the system would be forced to purge its data, effectively ejecting everyone trapped in the resin to save the forest. But to do it, she would have to enter the liquid metal vortex herself. The clearing was a hurricane of liquid silver and violet electricity. Dr. Maya Aris stood at the edge of the vortex, the metallic slime on her skin burning with an icy heat. Every instinct told her to run back into the green safety of the normal jungle, but Leo's voice, the desperate, digital echo of a boy lost for 20 years, pulled at her like a gravitational force. Arthur, Maya yelled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the atmospheric displacement. The system is redlining. If I don't vent the thermal load, Leo will burn out. Arthur Sterling was no longer a man. He was a flickering hologram, his form stretching and distorting as the system prioritized the defense of the core. You can't reach him, he stuttered, his voice breaking into digital artifacts. The interface is absolute. Maya ignored him. She grabbed a discarded oxygen tank from Thorn's gear, the one he had dropped when the vines claimed him. She didn't need the air. She needed the pressurized canister. If she could introduce a concentrated heat source or a sudden pressure change into the cooling vortex, the system's failsafe would have to trigger a data purge to prevent total core collapse. She dove into the silver mist. Inside the vortex, the laws of physics felt like suggestions rather than rules. She wasn't just moving through space, she was moving through information. Fragments of Thorn's tactical training, Arthur's botanical knowledge, and even the memories of the 1920s explorers flashed through her mind. It was a sensory overload, a neural canopy that threatened to overwrite her own identity. In the center of the storm, she saw him. Leo was suspended by thousands of silver threads that looked like glowing nerve endings. His body was a translucent vessel for a century of Amazonian data. The temperature here was dropping rapidly, the system desperately trying to compensate for the fever caused by Thorn's earlier disruption. Leo, listen to my voice, Maya shouted, reaching out with the canister. I'm going to break the loop. You have to let go of the dream. The white-eyed boy turned his head. The pressure in the room spiked. The silver threads began to lash out like whips, sensing the foreign object in Maya's hand. One thread sliced through her jacket, leaving a glowing violet mark on her shoulder. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt. It felt like 1,000 years of history being carved into her bone. I can't. Leo's voice was a chorus of 1,000 voices. If I let go, the forest forgets. Let it forget. Maya screamed. She jammed the oxygen tank into the base of the swirling violet column, where the cooling filaments were thickest. She didn't use a timer. She used the high-frequency vibrations of the room itself. She struck the valve with her heavy flashlight, causing the pressurized gas to hiss out into the 4 degrees Celsius environment. The thermal shock was instantaneous. The silver liquid, designed to stay at a constant freezing temperature, began to crystallize and crack. The impossible camp shrieked, a metallic, grinding sound that could be heard for miles. The violet light turned a chaotic, flickering orange. Thermal breach detected. A voice echoed. Not Arthur's, not Leo's, but the cold, foundational voice of the forest itself, purging archive data to preserve core integrity. Suddenly, the amber pods around the clearing began to shatter. The explorers, the pilots, and the soldiers, they didn't fall as corpses. They were ejected, their bodies glowing with a fading light as the resin that had sustained them for decades evaporated into the air. But Maya was still inside the vortex. And as the system began its purge, it identified her as the source of the heat. The silver threads around Leo began to constrict, drawing her into the center. The loop is breaking, Arthur's hologram whispered, standing just inches from Maya. His image was finally clear, showing a man who realized the weight of his sins. Take him, Maya. Take him and run. With a final, desperate surge of energy, Arthur's holographic form lunged at the cooling column, using his own digital mass to create a momentary shield. Go! The clearing erupted in a blinding flash of white and violet. The sonic boom of the data purge didn't just rattle the trees. It seemed to rip the very air apart. Maya felt the cold grip of the silver thread snap as the system's failsafe kicked in. The silver laboratory, the high-tech equipment, and the impossible structures began to dissolve into a fine, metallic mist that the Amazon winds instantly carried away. Maya felt herself falling, not through a vortex, but through the sudden, crushing weight of gravity. She hit the damp, mossy earth with a heavy thud. For a long moment, there was no sound. No humming, no static, no whispers. Just the natural, chaotic noise of the jungle, the drip of water from leaves, and the distant, territorial roar of a jaguar. Maya? The voice was small, cracked, and very human. Maya pushed herself up, her lungs burning. A few feet away, lying in a pile of decaying leaves and shattered resin, was a boy. He wasn't made of light anymore. He was wearing the tattered remains of a 2006-era t-shirt. He looked thin, his skin pale, but as he opened his eyes, they were no longer white or violet. They were a deep, clear brown. Leo, Maya whispered, crawling toward him. She reached out and touched his shoulder. He was warm. He was real. Beside him lay the older, weathered form of Arthur Sterling. He wasn't a hologram anymore, but he wasn't moving. The price of the shield he had provided was his own connection to the world. He had remained behind to push the reset button, his consciousness staying with the forest so his son could finally leave it. "Dad," Leo whispered, looking at Arthur's still body. "He saved you, Leo," Maya said, her voice trembling as she checked Arthur's pulse. There was none. He had chosen to be the final anchor for the system, ensuring the loop would never reopen. Maya looked around the clearing. It was no longer a silver laboratory. It was just a patch of dense jungle, indistinguishable from any other part of the Javari Valley. The other archived people, the 1920s explorers, the missing pilots, were gone. Whether they had finally passed on to where they belonged or wandered back into the green was a mystery the jungle would keep. 1 year later, the world still debated the miracle of the Javari. The GM tech firm had tried to suppress the satellite image, claiming it was a glitch. But they couldn't explain the appearance of a 32-year-old man, Leo, who had physically aged a few years during the purge, and a modern scientist emerging from the deepest part of the Amazon. Leo was now living under an assumed name in a quiet coastal town. He didn't remember much of the 20 years. To him, it felt like a long, vivid dream of being a tree, a river, and a storm all at once. But sometimes, when he looked at a forest, his eyes would catch a faint, violet shimmer that no one else could see. Maya sat in her new office, far from the corporate world of GM. She had lost most of her equipment, but she had kept one thing: the high-frequency sensor she had used in the clearing. It was broken, but its screen was permanently frozen. It didn't show a map or a temperature. It showed a single line of text, written in a code that didn't belong to any human language, yet she could read it perfectly. "The archive is closed. The green remembers you." She looked at her shoulder, where the silver thread had sliced her. The scar was still there, a faint, iridescent line that throbbed whenever a storm approached. The Amazon hadn't just archived her data, it had left a signature. She knew that somewhere, in the deepest heart of the Javari Valley, the impossible camp was gone, but the forest was still listening. And as long as the trees breathed, the story of the father and son who disappeared would remain, not as a tragedy, but as a part of the Earth's own memory.